So this tutorial is all about the materials I use on my YouTube videos, and also I give you alternative materials as well. But if you're starting out in watercolour and you don't want to spend a lot of money, I totally understand, of course. I've taught beginners for many years, so I've got a pretty good idea of the sort of starting out materials that you can buy on a budget, but you get good results as well. So I really hope you find this helpful. So, shall we get started? I would suggest getting 300 grams paper, that's equivalent to £140. A cold pressed or a rough would be great to start out with. And you can get Bockingford paper, which is great for beginners. Dale Rowney have a good Bockingford, and so do Winsor & Newton, but there are other great brands. So here's a Saunders Waterford paper that I use. I do use it as in sheet form, but this is on a watercolour block, so it stops the watercolour buckling so much. And this is 9 by 12 inches. It's quite a nice size, especially if you're starting out as a beginner. It's a rough surface. I quite like this surface here, but you can buy, obviously, Winsor & Newton have alternatives. So there's Arche and Fabriano. There's lots of great brands out there. And with the block, to release the paper, you place a palette knife, I would suggest, under the paper, which is what I'm doing here very carefully. It's a plastic palette knife because there's danger sometimes of using even a metal one. It could tear the paper. This is the top sheet that's protecting the pad. As you can see, it's gummed all the way around the edge and it helps the paper from buckling. So it's quite nice. So I'm just going to slip my palette knife in there and just remove this top sheet. But that's how you would remove your finished painting afterwards. So don't remove this until you finish your painting. Otherwise the paper may stretch and buckle again. So this prevents it, or helps prevent it. So here I am ready to start painting on top of this rough surface. One of the things I do advise students when they start my art classes is I don't feel you can skimp too much on paper. I really don't. Try to buy the best that you can afford. And obviously, if you can't afford, one of the really good artist papers, I would treat yourself to one good sheet, maybe buy it separately, and then just work on a cheaper pad just to practice. A lot of my students have worked this way, and then every now and again they'll treat themselves maybe to a sheet of Saunders Waterford, and they always say to me they have so much more time to paint. The paper is lovely, as is other artist brands like Arches, Fabriano, Winsor & Newton. I'm also aware that many of my audience are from all over the world, and there'll be different brands out there, and it would be great if you could share in the comment section the papers that you have really found great when you've started out in watercolor painting. So I'm using washi tape to use to tape around the edge of my painting to divide it up. Now, this is a big change to my art materials, my supplies. I normally use framing tape, which is brown adhesive tape that you stick down. You don't wet it like you do with gum tape that you use for stretching paper. But I've found a lot of my tutorials, there's been a little bit of confusion with the gum tape and the framing tape because they look so similar. I've decided to swap to the washi tape and to stick down for these white, to create the lovely white borders and to stick the paper to a board. This is quite thin washi tape, but you can get them in different widths. I've just been using it for a short time. So far, so good. It doesn't seem to have any leakage and it doesn't seem to tear my paper. And it just stops that confusion between the gum tape and the framing tape. But if you still have framing tape, carry on using it. I will be doing so. And if you haven't got any washi tape or framing tape, you can actually use masking tape as well. Just test all these different tapes out on your paper. I always use an HB pencil, nothing softer, nothing harder. I find softer pencils smudge, harder pencils scratch the surface. I just sharpen it with a pencil sharpener. I also love using a twig. This is a good substitute for a thin brush as well, especially if you're starting out. Just get a twig from the garden and I sharpen it with a pencil sharpener. You can see there it's got a really nice little point. These are the brushes I use. They're black velvet brushes by Silver Brush. Details about that can be found in the description below, but I use a size 14, 10, 6, 4 and 2. But if you're starting out in watercolor painting, all you need is a worker brush, a size 10 brush, and or a 12 or 10 brush, and a small brush like this size 2 brush, and you can do pretty much a lot with just these 2 brushes. It doesn't have to be the silk of the black velvet, just sort of a synthetic brush, sort of a medium to large size, and a small brush. You can see here I'm using my size 10 brush just with my sort of watercolors there, and just sort of swishing it on the paper. And I'm using the size 2 here, and you can see you get some really small lines, but it also carries lots of paint, so you can actually do some sort of small to medium washes as well. I love giving this using this brush for spattering as well. That's tapping my brush and releasing the paint, so you get lots of little dots, but it's a really lovely brush. Now here is the twig, look at it, it's brilliant. I'm just dipping it into paint and drawing it, and it creates these lovely thin lines, so you can actually do without that small brush as well. There's a close-up there. These are my 2 wash brushes. I would suggest you only need one of these. The mop brush on the right is by Winsor & Newton, but just any soft large brush to cover large areas in your painting. You can use a Hake as well. This is a stencil brush. I use it for lifting off paint. I've had it for years. It's just like a hog hair, but you could use an old oil brush or a hog hair brush and sort of just snip the top. And what it does, if you rub it in with I've wet it already, and you sort of rub it into dry paint, you can lift off paint. There we are, close up there. So it's really useful for that. But as a beginner, you could use a Q-tip, or this is an old synthetic brush here. It's a sort of a 1/2 inch, and you can use that to lift off paint as well. It's a useful technique to have. So there's lots of different sort of alternatives. You don't have to spend a fortune with these sort of brushes. This is my water pot here. It's a triple little water pot, so I've always got access to clean water, and it comes apart as well, so you can just use one of them. I've got a link for this water pot in the description below. But for beginners, you could use a jam jar. Here's a little plastic bottle I sort of cut down that I can use. It's really convenient, and you can have a couple of those and get painting. Now I just bought this recently from Amazon. It's by Meaden, but there's lots of different sort of empty watercolor boxes, and I've actually put the pans in there. This actually came with pans, but you can buy the pans separately. This is an empty pan here. I always work like this. I usually work with pans like this, and then I squeeze my paints in. So I always work with tubes, not necessarily pans, only every now and again. This is my favorite go-to way. But for beginners, you can actually get as I'm showing you here, a little watercolor box. It's a bit pricey, this one, but Winsor & Newton do very reasonable watercolor paints, and this is a little one I've made up myself here as well. So there's lots of alternatives out here, and I just wanted to show you the star of the show. This is my Craig Young palette. He makes these himself. It's actually numbered as well. It's a beautiful brass palette that I use a lot for my demonstrating for students. I haven't used it for a while, but it's quite heavy, so I don't usually use the ring at the bottom here because it's brass, but it's a little treasure. I bought this little watercolour box from Cass Art. I know Dale Rowney do something very similar. They're 1/4 pans. It was really reasonably priced. Lots of colours in there, and it's got the little ring there as well. It's a lot lighter. It's really nice paints as well. So I've got a link for that in the description below. It's also got a really nice little case here with a magnetic thing there. And it's almost like the size of a mobile phone. And it's great if you want to sketch outdoors or on holiday. And this is the Winsor & Newton Field set, and this is the artist one, but you can get a student one as well, which is a lot cheaper than this one. As you can see, it's been well used, and I've added my own pans to it as well. It does come with a set of pans. This is a water container as well, so if you're in the field painting away here, you can bring your own water, and you can this is the little water container, which is the lid to the field box. I will have a link in the description below because I actually do a review of this little Winsor & Newton field box when I first bought it, but it's got lots of mixing areas as well. I really recommend it. And if you're a beginner and you're on a budget, you can actually use an old white dinner plate. Don't use one that you're already using though, you'll get into trouble. But there are also very reasonable price plastic palettes. I'm actually using here the box that my core watercolor set came in. I'm using the base and the lid, and it's been brilliant, and you can just put them back together, the lid back on, and keep those paints paints when really drying out, but you can reawaken them, which is what I'm doing here, to paint again with them. I don't like to waste any of my paints. That's why when you see all my palettes and things like that, I don't wash them all, because I think that's all paint. I can use that again for another painting. And it's quite a nice way of starting a painting or even practicing. This is my spritzer bottle here. You can get these from a local pharmacy as well. They're great for re-wetting a painting and for lots of watercolour techniques. I'm using masking fluid here. You don't have to use masking fluid either. It's not necessary. I do use it. This is from Jackson's Art Supplies. There's lots of really good brands out there. I usually use blue masking fluid as well, so I can see it when I'm painting. This is Brusho that I use. I've been recently using this quite a lot, and I'll put a link for the Brusho in the description below, but it's a wonderful sort of medium that you can do lots of fun textured techniques here by spritzing with the water bottle as well. But if you haven't got access to Brusho, you can use a watercolour pencil and just an emery board here, which I'm using at the tip of that onto wet paper, or you can sketch with the watercolour pencil and then use a wet brush to reawaken the pigment there to create some really nice effects as well. And you don't have to use watercolour pencils, of course, especially if you're a beginner starting out in watercolour. I'm just using the tip here as well, like a pan that you would use in a watercolour box, using my size 4 brush, and you can just use it to get a wash. Great for travelling, you know, sort of being outdoors. If you're on holiday, you can do a little bit of sketching. This is a natural sponge that I actually bought when I was in Greece, but you can get those again from a pharmacy, or you can use a synthetic sponge as well. So I'm mixing up a little bit of paint here, just some green paint, just to show you what I do with my sponge. I love printing with the sponge to create some nice effects for foliage, for trees and bushes and things. And you can sponge wet on dry or wet on wet. You get some really nice effects. I would say always make plenty of creamy paint when you're sponging. This is my favourite material and my favourite technique. I'm just painting on some creamy dark green here, and I'm just using a little bit more blue. I want plenty of creamy paint. I don't want it too wet because I'm going to be using my plastic card. And this is an ordinary store card or bank card, an old bank card that I've cut up into different sort of sizes. And what I do is I paint on quite rich creamy paint. You don't want it too thin because it doesn't really create a lot of contrast. So I've got lots of paint here. Wait for it to dry for a bit. You still want the shine to be on the paper, otherwise the paint won't lift off. And you just sort of lift off like that, sweep it, be sort of quite quick when you do this. Practice it as well. It is such a fun technique. I love it. I do lots and lots of abstract work with this as well. Just an ordinary plastic card, and it just gives so much. You can print with it to create thin grasses. Well, what can I say? I just absolutely love it. So that's one way of creating lots of light and dark grasses. Just giving it a little spatter there with my size 2 brush as well. When you're spattering, hold that brush firm and tap at the end of it, not at the top of it. So I'm creating some rocks here with the plastic card. Really swipe that paint. Don't be tentative, really be the boss of it, but don't keep going back over the same area because sometimes you can tear the paper. So here I am swiping. That's the motion I'm doing. Not slow like that. You want to do it fast, not slow, otherwise it won't lift off. And I'm printing here as well, and painted some, pulled out some grasses there. It's great fun. The other thing I didn't do here is you can actually scratch into the paper and the paint falls into the scratch. You get a dark mark. So this is another thing I do a lot of. It's the salt. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about salt. I get lots of questions about salt. So I'm just putting on a wash. One of the questions I get is, when do you put the salt on? So I'm putting the salt on here when the paint's really, really wet. Okay, now I'm putting the salt on when the sort of paint's not so wet now, but the shine is still there. And now I'm putting the salt on when it's dry. So just wait and see what happens. And I'm doing the same thing here because the interesting thing about this one I've just painted, the one at the top, it's ultramarine and yellow. Ultramarine sometimes doesn't work so well with salt because of the granulation. I think it does it sort of almost sort of fights against the salt. So I've actually used the Phthalo turquoise here to do exactly the same technique. I'm putting the salt on when it's very wet, not so wet, and when it's drying off. So you can see here now a close-up where the salt was put on very wet. It's not really behaving itself properly. I like the salt in the middle of both of those, where it's lifted off the paint to create those lovely effects. And what you need to do is make sure your painting is dry before you brush it off, and don't blow dry your painting until the salt has done its magic. But it's great. This is great for beginners. You've got access to this in the cupboard. You know, it's a very little cost. The same with the plastic card as well. A little bit of recycling there. This is a wax crayon, but you can use a wax candle for this. And I'm just rubbing it onto the watercolor paper. You need to practice this to see, because different papers do different things, and it depends how hard you press, but it resists the watercolor paint. Look at that. It'd be great for water and texture on walls and all sorts of things. So that's something, especially as a beginner, you've got access to a wax candle, and have a little bit of fun with the wax resist. I'm using my pencil here. I'm just using a plastic eraser, and as you can see, it takes off the pencil lines really, really well and doesn't damage the paper at all. And it didn't cost me very much, so great for beginners. I like using gouache, and actually I'd recommend a beginner get a little tube of gouache. It really does help rescue paintings. That's by Schminke, but there's lots of different brands out there. And as you can see here, I'm spattering with it, but it's quite nice to hide mistakes. This is my drawing pen here. Again, they're quite reasonably priced for beginners. It's a 0.8 Unipin waterproof black ink pen. It's great if you're starting out learning to draw. It stops all that rubbing out of the pencil. It trains your eye to see. As you can see here, that's one way of drawing with it. There's lots of different ways. It's a much more of a loose style of sketching here, but using a pen and wash is a great way of learning to paint in watercolor as well. I love using this with my sketchbook. It's just so much fun to use. And here I am just putting on the paint very loosely. You don't have to use too much watercolor paint with pen and wash. It's actually a lot less. You put on a lot paler washes, and I'll put a link in the description below for a pen and wash tutorial that I've done recently. And just to show you, the twig is making its appearance again. You can also sketch with your twig. You could use watercolor paint or Indian ink from the bottle, and it's quite nice. It's so much fun to sketch with. You can be very loose and very expressive. And I'm using some saran wrap, or cling film we call it in the UK here. I'm actually not even using that. I'm actually just using some clear plastic bag that I tore that was just going to be ready for the recycling. But if you put that on wet paint and just sort of manipulate it a little bit, let it dry, look what it does. It really creates some lovely textures. Great for, you know, painting the sea and things like that. And again, I've got a tutorial that I've made previously. I'll put a link for that in the description below if you're interested. Now, I love using sketchbooks. I've got all sorts of different sketchbooks here. And what I love about these moleskin sketchbook, you've got a little pocket at the back here. It's a sketch I did last year when I was in Tenerife, my last holiday. But you can just sort of have fun with these sketchbooks, and it's great when you're starting out in watercolor. And I've got a link in the description below, believe it or not, for a review I did of the moleskin sketchbooks. But here's another one. You've probably seen a lot of this sketchbook on my YouTube tutorials there. And again, it's got a little envelope at the back here. You can keep all your keepsakes in there as well on your journeys. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a demo here using some of the techniques. So I'm using my large brush here, large brush, large area, small brush, small area, or large brush, small area, but definitely not small brush, large area. So I'm just sweeping on some of the paints I've mixed up here. One thing I haven't done is speak about the paints. As a beginner, all you need is 3 primary colours. I've got a lot of tutorials on my YouTube channel where I just use 3 colours: ultramarine, permanent rose, and a cadmium yellow. And you can pretty much get a lot of colours from those, and then gradually you can start adding to them. And there's lots of student variety paints out there that are very reasonably priced and very, very good quality. Winsor & Newton, Rowney. And you can then gradually start adding a burnt sienna, a Prussian blue, a cerulean, a cadmium red, and then maybe start treating yourself to some artist colours, but just take it step by step. As you can see here, I'm just using wet on wet techniques here, drizzling in some paints and using my twig to pull out and scratch in the paper, as I said earlier as well. It's such a great technique. And it's nice just to do doodles like this. Here's a bit of sponging into damp paper here, and I'll use a little bit of salt to sprinkle on. But sometimes it's just nice just to doodle with these different materials. Some of them you can just find around the house, save yourself a fortune and get some wonderful effects. And as you can see, I'm just scratching off with my card. So I've got just a make-believe, I've just done this for my imagination, distant sort of trees there with some water, with some foreground grasses and wildflowers. So I really hope you found this tutorial helpful, and if you have any questions at all, please put them in the comments section below. And if there's any materials you don't feel I've covered and you'd like to ask more questions, again, put those in the comments section below and I will try and get back to you as soon as I can. If you like this tutorial and you'd like to see more like it, don't forget, if you haven't already, to subscribe to my YouTube channel and you will get updates of my latest videos. And if you'd like to see more in-depth tutorials, they are available on my Patreon membership, and details about that can be found in the top right hand corner or in the description below. Just click show more, or if you're on a tablet, I think you just click the little down arrow. So I really hope this has helped you on your watercolour journey. Thank you again for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.